Hello, and welcome to this presentation for the 2020 NSS Convention digging section. This is a presentation about the Dome 12 dig project, which is a sinkhole dig on the Northeast Cave Conservancy's Merlins Cave Preserve. The Merlins Cave Preserve is located in southwestern New York State, near the border with Massachusetts along the Berkshire Taconic Range. And in this area, it's Stockbridge marble just over the border into New York. This is relatively unusual in New York. There isn't a lot of marble, not a lot of young marble outside of the Adirondacks. And this cave is more like Massachusetts and Vermont caves. We dug open Merlin's Cave on the preserve property before it was a preserve in 2007. And then the Northeast Cave Conservancy acquired the property in 2012, along with a line of sinkholes that are downstream from the main cave. The main cave is about a half mile of pretty significant passages for the area, including some large rooms, some domes, climbs, waterfalls, plenty of tight spots. But the sinkholes continue for another half a mile, so we were pretty convinced that there is more cave there to be found. The sinkhole immediately downstream of the cave, the Dome 12 sinkhole, had a washout in 2011 while the preserve was under purchase, and that was due to tropical storms Irene and tropical storm Lee, which gave us a combined 18 inches of rain over the course of a couple of weeks. And that led to this, you can see here, large amount of gravel washing out of the sinkhole. So at that point, we went from this being a somewhat interesting sinkhole with a stream going in to a very interesting sinkhole. We did some initial work on it, and then we mostly put it down and it washed in a little bit more. We came back to it after having worked on some other projects for a while in 2016. And this was a good opportunity to have a dig that we could work on in spring before bats come out of hibernation and when our other caves aren't typically accessible, and in the fall when hunting season cuts off access to some of the properties that we have other projects on. So this is Morgan in the sinkhole in spring 2016, cleaning out the back wall of the sink. And at this point, we were just excavating whatever we could get our hands on and looking for bedrock, because we figured, hey, if all that gravel left, it went down somewhere into something. The first step is to figure out where in the sinkhole it went away. So we did, in fact, uncover bedrock, both schist bedrock, which you can see overhung here ahead of Raymond, and marble bedrock that you can't see as well in this photo, but you'll see in later photos as we get deeper. So the marble bedrock and the schist bedrock are on opposite sides of the sinkhole, and the marble bedrock runs at an angle down under the schist on the uphill side. So the water is coming off of the schist and flowing into this sinkhole, and presumably on the contact between the marble and the schist, getting into some underground space. So we started in the corner where we had the most bedrock, which is away from where the stream is coming in, and pretty much started digging down in that corner. In the spring, as you can see, we would have a lot of dripping water that had formed a nice glacier in the way. And so in this photo, we're hauling a large chunk of ice out of the sinkhole, and you can see the remnants of the ice on the left side as well. However, this is a dig that is still accessible in April, so we were happy to have one, even though it meant pulling chunks of ice instead of rocks. By spring 2017, we had gotten quite a ways down. As you can see, Jacob is significantly deeper in this than the first photos I showed you. But we did have a collapse not long after this photo was taken, where the debris slope that Charlene is standing on in the purple helmet all collapsed into the hole, and we ended up having to take that out too. And this is an ongoing feature of the dig, that for every foot or two down that we went, we ended up having to widen the upper level because the debris slope became unstable in some form. After a while, we said, forget that. And in 2017, we just stepped the entire pile back a long way and started working on some rock retaining walls to hold everything in place, figuring if we clear out a nice big space in the area where we want to dig down, and then we put a lot of steps in going up out of the sinkhole, then it won't collapse in on anybody else. We also installed a bucket rail in here. This is a thing that we've used in quite a lot of our digs, where you have loose material around the top of the sink, you have various things you don't want to hit with the bucket on the way up, but you don't have necessarily a straight pull up. So this is just two saplings with cross pieces drilled and screwed together, and this lets you just slide the bucket up out of the sinkhole. It reduces the number of people necessary to pass the bucket, and it makes it possible to work on a larger dig project like this with only a couple of people, even if you're not as efficient as you would be with 5 or 6 or 10. So with the bucket rail in place, we continued digging down along the back wall of the sink. As you can see in this photo, there's a hole down there in the back corner, and we actually hit marble on the back wall also. And that marble was pretty encouraging because it meant we were fully out of the schist, which is a pretty crumbly rock, into solid marble that carves. So we started digging down along that back corner in fall of 2017, and after quite a lot of work, we were able to get to where we could see a small room. And here Emmett and Larry are passing some buckets up to the rail, and the small room is sort of back toward where the photo was taken, and it's looking underneath some of the debris pile. We knew that was going to be a bit of a problem, but we figured we would deal with it when we got to it. This is another view into the small room. In fact, we were able to get a couple of people in there briefly to get a look around, but over the winter it collapsed as we expected. But they did observe that there was a carved solid tube headed downstream, and that carved tube looked like a good dig project. So we figured, okay, we need to get back to this room in solid marble, and then we can dig that tube and we'll be headed in a good direction. So once again, we went back up to the top of the sinkhole, stepped everything back quite a ways, and put in a more substantial retaining wall to hold the material back. This is Raymond here. He's standing right on top of where we eventually need to dig, and then you can see the retaining wall running up the slope of the sinkhole in the back to hold all of that debris so it doesn't end up down in the hole where we want to go. In fall of 2018, we took the bucket rail out briefly and moved it to the side so that we would be able to dig down in that location. And we assessed that the room was still there and started to figure out what rocks we could leave and what rocks we had to take out. And there's one very large rock, conveniently. Christian in the bright blue on the left is climbing down past it. And that very large rock ended up being a solid piece that we left in place so that we could stack rocks above onto that rock and hold everything back. Here's the bucket rail in spring of 2019 as we were putting it back in place with a few repairs. The cross pieces rot out sometimes, and you can see the glacier that's formed filling up basically the entire hole at this point that you saw in the previous photo. So at this point, we're just doing cleanup on the dig, and eventually we have to wait for the ice to melt or haul it all out of the sink. But we were able to clean up around the glacier and continue digging down in the location that we want to go down, even with the glacier partially in the way. So by fall in 2019, we had got down to the point where we were down past that large rock I was telling you about. The bucket rail was stable, the other piles of rock were stable, and Raymond here with the green helmet is looking down through a hole back into the small room. And this is the point where I can tell you that actually we already got into cave here. The small room, once we got back down into it, it turned out that that room, the tube had washed out on the way in. And so with a minimal amount of additional rock removal, we were able to get down into cave. You can see this is a nice solid tube headed down into the cave. It's not very big, but it's comfortable size as far as the northeast is concerned. That room comes out at the top of a fissure with an 18-foot climb down, and that fissure is carved blue solid marble, water raining out of the ceiling, looked like big passage on the way down, and we thought this is looking like it's going to be pretty excellent. We're just about into cave here, and of course it didn't stay that way. The passage headed slightly uphill, took a big Z, went around a corner to where I'm sticking my head out of a fissure here. Of course there was another crawl, and that crawl ended in a drain that is also a dig. There were some nice carved fins and other things in there though. And that north drain ended up being a dig that we worked on for a little while. Here's Christian pulling sleds through that fissure out of the north drain. And here's another view of the fissure looking towards it. Beyond the sled, there's hole that goes down and eventually some tubes leading into some very small rooms where we had just enough room to get a bucket through. We actually had to dig the tubes larger to get this small bucket through and up to the sled. This north drain, however, did not pan out very well. It took us to a narrow fissure with a hole that does seem to be going down with a lot of debris in it and maybe some airflow, but it was doubling back under the entire cave, headed back toward the entrance. However, we also opened a south passage from the bottom of the drop where you could get through a fissure into a room basically underneath the sinkhole itself, where there was a lot of water and debris coming in from the top, and we thought, okay, so here's another way to go. That south passage continues downstream a little bit and then goes to a hole in the floor right here where water comes out of the ceiling, goes into this hole, and flows down a tight crawlway that's pretty wide but low and full of gravel and debris. And this is where we need to dig next. This is our project potentially later in the summer when things are very dry. We can get some sleds in here and pull some gravel and stuff out. So here's an overview map of the cave. The entrance is more or less in the middle with the sinkhole offset, and it takes you down to a drop. The drop is now only 14 feet on the map rather than 18, as you can see, because we piled a bunch of debris at the bottom of it that we pulled out of the north drain up on the north end over here. And then the south drain is over here, and that's a place that we still need to work and are thinking we're going to be able to get to later on in the year. Relative to Merlin's cave, this is past the end of the known cave and offset quite a bit. And one of the problems that we have with Merlin's cave is that at the end of the cave, the water all just kind of drains horizontally through the wall into some other place. And there's little drains all along this very long, like 300-foot long stretch of very large fissure passage. And it's unclear where you need to get through. There's lots of clay and mud in the wall and mud in the floor, and there's just not an obvious dig right there. There are some projects that we've worked on in there, but not an easy way onward. But the water continues downstream quite a ways. There's another half mile of sinkholes on the property, as I mentioned. So we're very hopeful that actually heading back towards the main cave is maybe going to get us into whatever parallel is taking the water out of Merlin's cave, and then we'll be able to go downstream again. Both of these caves are formed in an area that has a lot of faulting, and so the faults here are probably controlling development more than we would like. The faults are actually angled slightly uphill, and that means probably the water has to jump through fault fractures against the line of the fracture itself. At the end of last year, we shored up the dig. We put in a bunch of cut hophorn beam in the entrance area just to hold debris back over the winter as that glacier forms and all the ice forms. We did go back into the cave a couple of times in the winter to work on projects so we could see that everything was working out okay. The idea was that we were going to put a culvert in at some point in 2020. Everything we were intending to do in 2020 is a bit on hold right now, but we'll see if we can get to it before the end of the year. As always, we got to thank the people who are involved on this dig, and quite a lot of people have been involved on this dig project. I honestly can't tell you how many more people were on there besides these, but these are all the people that I'm pretty sure were here multiple times. This has been a community project for a little while, and we're hoping now that we're going to be able to get into some more cave, maybe before next year. At the very least, we've got a project that we can work that is a not very long cave that's pretty safe to work during quarantine conditions. So we'll be planning to work on it again this fall and winter.